Hi everyone, I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and thank you so much for tuning into our talk today. We are a year-round digital talk series bringing you the best creative voices across film, television, and theater. And today we're joined by Natalie Krinsky, who is the writer and director of Broken Hearts Gallery. And I wanted to start by talking a little bit about the journey of the script, because it's so fascinatingly wonderful. And the fact that you originally wrote this in your 20s after going through a breakup yourself, but then it's a script that just kind of kept popping up along the way. And I was really interested in the fact that you said that the central character of Lucy, who Geraldine Viswanathan plays, always kind of remained the same, but it was some of the details and the beats that shifted. And I was really interested in what those beats were that really evolved throughout the years with the script.
Sure. I think, I think I've said this before, but as a writer, I think the last thing you ever want to do is to read something that you wrote like 5 or 6 years ago. Like I say, I'd rather be buried alive, honestly, than have to do that sometimes. But, I think the story really, the way that she came to the idea of the gallery, Nick was never really worked in a hotel, which he does now, and his story and his journey of like what he wanted and what he was pursuing in his own right changed over time. But I think the central, like who she is in terms of this like kind of strange, lovable, sometimes anxiety-ridden person who maybe, in the best way is a bull in a china shop sometimes, always stayed very true. And I also think the relationship with the roommates was something that was really important to me to kind of be grounded on some level in my own like tough, loving relationship with my own close friends. So those things were always the same, but the arc of the love story, the arc of the professional story, those things changed certainly over the years.
Yeah. And I love that dynamic with her roommates and that friendship, and the way that you really crafted these characters that feel incredibly developed no matter how much time they're on screen for. What was kind of your process as you were writing to make sure that you really were making them fully dimensional and giving them a lot of autonomy in the story as well?
I think for the most part, it was really channeling my, as I said, it sort of touched on like my friendships in my 20s and the way that we spoke to one another. I think you spend an inordinate amount of time just kind of like sitting on your couch, hanging out, dissecting life and the world and like, what's happening and what's going right and what's going wrong, and just drinking wine and being silly and like watching YouTube and whatever else is happening. And I think, for me, it was channeling some of those relationships in my own life and on some level sometimes like heightening them a little bit for comedy and for voice and things like that. But those women are really the way that my girlfriends and I talk to each other, and the banter and the unconditional support, even with tough love, was something that was really important to me to kind of keep throughout the movie. I didn't want the girls to fight for kind of a manufactured dramatic reason, perhaps.
Yeah, and there's such a great dynamic in the way that you've written the characters of Nick and Lucy as well, and that they really complement each other despite the fact that they're also very different people. So they're both opposing at the same time. Did you think about kind of what those dynamics were going to be that were really going to tessellate within each other as you were writing?
Yeah, definitely. I think what I always said to Geraldine, who plays Lucy, and then Dacre Montgomery, who plays Nick, is that their dynamic is a little bit, and Lucy touches on it in a scene, but she says we're a monster and a human. And Lucy is the kind of person who's going to like jump right into the water, doesn't test whether it's warm, doesn't test whether it's safe, doesn't care, and then like encourages everyone around her to just do the same because it's not a big deal. And like, come in, water's warm. And then, the second Nick jumps in, she's like, sharks, what do I do? And I think that, I joke that that's like a little bit of my relationship with my husband. He's a little bit more of the cautious one, and I'm like, who cares? And then I tend to get us into sometimes maybe a little in over our heads, but that's where the excitement comes from. And so that's kind of was the guiding principle, and both for performance and on the page that we kind of adhered to, like watching the push pull of that relationship, I think is really quite fun.
Yeah, and the comedic timing, not just in that relationship, particularly with that central character with Lucy, and the delivery from Geraldine is so superbly delivered. And I was interested in the collaborative relationship between the two of you and working with what was on the page, but also really looking at her strengths as a performer and how to really bring that out in the best way.
I think Geraldine is an incredible performer, and I was a fan of hers from Blockers and from Hala, and I think that just range of work between like the comedic timing that she displays in Blockers, she's like a young Lucille Ball, and then the emotional depth that she displays in Hala, and I sort of asked her to call on both of those skill sets inside this film, because though Lucy is really a bright and sunny character mostly, she, there is like a anxiety and a darkness and kind of a bit of a some emotional turmoil underneath the surface there. And I think that, one of the things that she and I did was we really, we rehearsed a lot and we worked on the scenes, and we were partners in this. She's in every scene of the movie and she does incredibly well. And so we made sure to be able to kind of make sure that the comedy in those scenes were working from a rehearsal point of view, so that when we got there on the day, where Geraldine is like an incredible improvisational actress, and some of her scene partners like Arturo Castro or Molly Gordon and Philippa Sue are also able to do that. And so it was amazing to be able to grab what was on the page and then also be able to, like, even for a lower budget movie, improv a few scenes and a few moments here and there that like ended up making it in. And so it was really a balance between I think you can only, one of the lessons I've learned as a director is you can only really improvise if you're over prepared. And so that was kind of our guiding principle in being able to give ourselves a little bit of freedom on the day to play.
In terms of the space that you were creating, not just for that improvisation, but also, the emotional depth of those characters, what was the space that you worked to create on set for your cast, and the way that you really wanted to give them feedback in scenes so that they really had that safety net to try different things with you?
I love that question. Thank you. I think that for me, it was really important to create a very safe environment on set where not just the performers, but everyone felt, this kind of familial safety on our set. And I think that the best work comes not from fear, but from feeling as if like your ideas will be accepted and heard. And that doesn't for a director necessarily mean that you're taking every suggestion, but it does mean that you will listen to suggestions. And I think that for me, what was important was to sort of open the lines of communications to my actors and say, if something's not working for you, or if we're feeling like, you're feeling uncomfortable or something's going awry, I'm the first person. I'm the person who is kind of the architect of this set. And so I'm the one who can fix those problems. And so in terms of feedback, it really depends on the performer. I think some performers are fine if you are from behind the monitor and going, hey, try this, toss something out. Other performers are more comfortable if you kind of approach them quietly. So I think you just have to gauge, each person's comfort level. And kind of like, ironically, I gave birth to my second child 2 days ago. Each child is a little bit different. Some things work for one kid, some things don't work for another. And that's the same with grown people. You have to kind of gauge how we're going to get the best work out of each performer and approach them accordingly. Because I think that's truly the work of a director, from performers all the way, to, lighting or grips or whatever.
Yeah. And one of the other aspects of the film that I wanted to dive into was the visual aesthetics. And, it's so thoughtful in terms of the color palette down to the production design, the way that you've lit the film. And I was really interested in what your process was for creating that first initial visual picture of what you wanted the film to look like. And then obviously communicating that with each of your department heads and collaborating with them on creating what looks so wonderful on screen.
I think that primarily as a writer, I was quite insecure when I began this process just about how was I going to convey what was in my brain in terms of like a visual language to my department heads. That was something that I found to be a challenge because, I've been so used to, I talk about story, I talk about script, I talk about dialogue, but I haven't really had many conversations where I'm talking about like the interior design of someone's room, or like what clothes they should wear, and of course those things are all in service of the story, right? So one of the first things that I did when we decided that I was directing the film was I took quite a bit of time and I made a lookbook. And so I really like sort of drilled down and poured through images and poured through photography and, you know, hours and hours, and kind of put together what I consider to be like a bit of a Bible. It was a jumping off point. This is how I see this movie, and this is my way of explaining it. And that Bible really did guide us through the process. You know, I was trying to make a film that, you know, sort of felt like a studio comedy, but, you know, still had aspects that felt like real and felt like New York and wasn't overlit and sort of had this glowy, almost dreamy quality to it. I wanted Lucy's room to feel almost like a wonder emporium. I wanted the hotel, you know, all the colors in Lucy's room are sort of like yellows and pinks, and it's kind of a cocoon of warmth. And the place that she gets that, you know, sort of from a color palette point of view is also like in the hotel. Those colors are kind of turned up to like red and mustard, and, you know, they're sort of, they mirror one another in their own way. And so I think I started from that lookbook, and that was something that I presented to producers. And then as we began to hire department heads, it was really something that could initiate conversation, and I could explain through the images what I saw and why I saw the things in the way that I did. And then of course, I always say that the joy of being a director is you get to hire like all these talented people and then take credit for their work. And so, you know, as a jumping off point, then, you know, my production designer Zazu Myers could kind of bring that vision to life and put in some of her own ideas and thoughts that were so creative and incredible. And my, you know, DP L.R. Cavillo could advise on aspect ratio and lenses and, you know, things that I'm still, you know, learning about. And so it was really good to have this kind of roadmap that we could then, in the same way, like improvise off of and find even better solutions.
Yeah, I also very specifically love the design of the hotel setting, because it isn't just a space that exists, it's very fluid and it really evolves alongside the characters. So how is the journey of that specific space really different to all of the other settings and locations in the film because of that?
We had to dress that set so many times and so quickly, and I have to give a ton of credit to the art department and set deck for pulling that together, because there is, you know, we were only in that space I think for about a week, and it goes from construction site to fully realized, you know, installation and completed hotel. So it was a feat, and it was, you know, it kind of mirrored as these two were sort of coming together. The hotel began to mirror, like, you know, as their relationship was like moving closer and closer, the hotel moved closer and closer as well. So, you know, we had to do a lot of planning about like, you know, sort of the nitty gritty of boarding and kind of trying to figure out like what scenes were when, but all the hotel scenes were shot chronologically because we needed to build it as we went. And one of the really fun things that we actually did was we installed a GoPro in one of the corners so that we would be able to sort of fast motion eventually see the sort of evolution of the hotel, which is just fun little footage that we have, you know, for ourselves to sort of relish in our accomplishment of building a hotel in a week.
That's so fantastic. And in terms of that journey of developing this new sense of visual language beyond the script, as you're kind of continuing to write other projects since this, has it made you think differently about the words that you're putting on the page, the way that you're describing the visual language in a script at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think making your first film is, you know, so informative in so many ways, because not only, I think, first of all, not only does it change because you've been through every part of the process, when you're starting again from scratch on something, I think on some level, there are so many things that become easier. And then on some level, there are things that become more difficult because you have such a critical eye about, I know how quickly we have to jump into the story. I know, you know, what this is going to, you know, how much, like, how do we introduce a character in the most efficient way? Like, how do we fall in love with them quickly? So there's things that happen to the words on the page. And then of course, the practical realities of like bringing something to life is totally different. I don't know that it's changed really the way that I necessarily describe things on the page, but I will say that in terms of something that has become part of my creative process in many of the things that I do is actually from pitch stage. I've sort of started to make lookbooks for every single one of my projects, or visual boards, in a way that I never did before, because I think that that enriches the way that I visualize the world, and in turn enriches sort of like what ends up on the page, if that kind of makes sense. Yeah.
I also love that the production company behind the film really wanted you to direct this. And that's so often a battle that first-time directors really have to fight and really have to push for. And so how was that a really valuable tool to you in the way that it like empowered you to know that you could go forth, make these choices with their support behind you, and you had that safety net at the same time to still be able to turn around and ask questions when you needed to on the journey?
I think in that exact way that you described. I mean, you know, I had been so specific about, and perhaps to my detriment, I think I had always wanted to direct, but I figured I would like create a television show, and then in like season 2, episode 13, like I would be able to like say, oh, can I direct this episode? And I think part of me was a little bit too timid to come forward and say, I want to direct this movie. And so what a gift that the suggestion came the other way. That's like a one in a million. I won the lottery, and I will be the first to admit that. But in winning the lottery, you know, you have to step up to the task of taking it on. And so I think that it was a balance between understanding what I wanted, but also understanding what I didn't know. And I think that that's two very different things. I know what I want to achieve, but sometimes I don't know exactly how to achieve that. And that's when I will rely on my department heads, or I will rely on my producers and ask the questions, because, you know, I don't ever portend to be the smartest person in the room. So.
Something that not all directors do. And in terms of the casting of the film, there's something great that you mentioned where, you know, from writing on Grey's Anatomy and seeing the way that Shonda Rhimes would never prescribe an ethnicity or a race to a character before casting it, that she really allowed it to be driven by the casting choice itself, and that was something that you carried forth into this film. How did that influence the way that you were thinking about and shaping these characters and setting up your auditions for everybody?
You know, I really cast this movie based primarily on like people that I was a fan of in other movies or television shows or in other content. So I think for me, it was about, you know, I don't want to say colorblind because it's such a like sticky thing, but really it was about like, what performers do I love? And then how can I get them into this film? And like, what is the best match between a character I've created and a performer that I love? And like, you know, sometimes those were from things I'd seen. Sometimes there were, you know, people who my casting directors had suggested, like that, you know, that process was fluid in that way. But I think that was sort of the way that I matched things. And then, you know, if a character needs to be, you know, kind of tweaked or altered based on a performer, we can always do that. But I didn't want any, you know, sort of this, I wanted to create a world where I wanted to create a film that was reflective of the world that we live in as it is today. And that we look around, and any person who goes to see the movie can look around and hopefully like see a version of themselves represented without feeling as if we're like checking boxes.
Yeah, and even within that, it feels like a very realistic portrayal of New York. And I know that you were filming exteriors in New York, but actually a lot of it was filmed in Canada. So how did you kind of map out making sure that when someone watches this film, that it's still going to feel like you're living and breathing in New York City?
Well, we actually shot only 2 days in New York. So you know, I am Canadian originally, and then when I was 14, we moved to New York. So I have this, I just love the city, and I sort of dream in the city, and I've always wanted to make a New York romantic comedy. So for me, it was just having lived there for a big portion of my life. I really, you know, sort of had, and part of the lookbook was like, how am I going to portray New York? And a lot of that was sort of smaller storefronts, like in Brooklyn and kind of things like that I gravitated to, almost like an old version, a less commercialized version of New York and on some level. And so some of those choices actually ended up translating really well to being able to shoot in Toronto, because we could sort of find little neighborhoods and spots that we would be able to, that felt New Yorky to me, and that we were able to pick and choose. And I think one of the greatest sort of tools that I had was I had a really great locations manager, and we spent a lot of time very early on where I also showed her the lookbook and tried to explain what I was trying to achieve in Toronto. And I think that gave her a good roadmap of being able to quickly, instead of showing me a ton of places and me saying, no, being able to kind of be very targeted in her pursuit of what she was going to show me. And that ended up being like an incredible relationship, and really was, I hopefully think that you see it on screen.
It does. I've lived in New York for 12 years, and I was feeling nostalgic for the city that existed.
That's the goal.
I also wanted to chat a little bit about, the objects within the gallery that you create within the story itself, because I think what you do so beautifully, even just in the way you've crafted it into the script, is that each object that comes into this world has a full complex story behind it. So kind of like, what was that process for figuring out what each of the items were going to be, and what these little miniature stories were that you wanted to feed into the overall narrative?
That was really inspired by one of my favorite romantic comedies, When Harry Met Sally, the couch confessionals. And I think that, I wanted the stories to be reflective of the characters and what I imagined for them. And, sometimes for many of our, one of the great things was I would choose something and I would choose a story and I would write it. And again, it was kind of the same thing. We had a lot of also local Canadian performers, like the woman who comes in with the cast, and the, the contact lenses, or the sweatshirt. And those are like really talented Canadian comedians that we hired. And so I was able to kind of communicate with them, like, here's what's on the page, here's the story that I imagine. And we would do it a couple times on the page, and then we would try and grab like little, comedic vignettes to sort of amplify what was already there, where we worked together. And I would say, oh, try this, or they would say, hey, can I try this little thing? And so it was really fun, because I think it made them feel quite natural and like they were real breakup stories in the way that we were able to shoot and talk about them. And it was really fun to imagine. It's fun to be able to imagine this, like, for a character that might appear on screen for all of 2 minutes, to kind of imagine some like rich history. And I think it also helps the performers, because they kind of get to fit into these shoes that they're occupying like a little bit better for a day or two, and then move on with their lives.
And because you were mentioning When Harry Met Sally, and obviously there's so many rich stories within the genre to look to for inspiration, what was, did you kind of go back and revisit any of those stories and really look at what was it that made these so successful? What is it about the way that they structure that narrative arc and the journey that these characters go on as you were writing this? Or did you really just kind of sit down and write it in its own bubble, in its own world, and then look at it for more of a visual aesthetic, like you were mentioning with the When Harry Met Sally sofa vignettes?
Well, I think it all fits in. I mean, I think that the evolution of the script, it's like I wrote it 10 years ago, and the process then was one thing, and, came very much from my life. And then when I had to rewrite it, it was also like sort of examining some of those structures. But I've been such a long time fan of the genre that, some of those films are committed to memory. Like Bridget Jones, there's definitely that tribute in the beginning of Lucy's like disastrous speech is definitely like a Kafka motorbike tribute to Bridget Jones, and all the walk and talks in New York and the confessionals are definitely like a bit of a tribute to When Harry Met Sally, and like Lucy's hopefully like rapid fire, dialogue is like a little bit of a tribute to His Girl Friday. Like, I think that for me, those things have been like ingrained as just a fan for such a long time. And then one of the funny things with this film was that I rewrote it, and of course, even the first rewrite is not perfect. And then we cast, and, we cast Geraldine and we cast Dacre, and then I got a call from my producers that Geraldine's schedule on something else, on Miracle Workers, was being pulled forward. And so we went from casting these two characters to 2 weeks later we were in prep. And that was, you know, though this script has been around for a long time, that was like breakneck speed. So I was like, you know, doing rewrites almost in my own bubble as much as I could during prep to lead up to the actors arriving, in addition to everything else, you know, that I was doing. So it was it was slow and fast at the same time. And the process kind of changed because when I was leisurely, I could kind of like, you know, think about these other things. And then when I was like under the gun, it was like in a bubble and just like go and see what we can come up with.
How did that impact the way that you had to then make incredibly fast choices as a director in pre-production without having kind of that luxury of the discovery time that you probably were hopefully anticipating?
Yeah, I mean, I am a person who will say, especially in this business, always better to be pulled forward than pushed back. You know, pushed back means we wait and something can fall apart. Pull forward means at least we're going. You know, I think, again, I have to say, and I don't mean to sort of harp on this idea, but the lookbook helped a lot because I had made so many of those decisions prior that helped guide us in this like very fast prep process that happened, you know, kind of so quickly, and that we just had to move forward and like throw caution to the wind and see what happens. So that, I'm telling you, that Bible just really saved my life.
For every project. And then kind of going back to the character of Lucy, one of the things that I love so much about her and the way that it feels like it subverts the genre to a degree is that, you know, she has a strong identity. She knows exactly who she is. And the fact that you don't make her change who she is at all. There's so many things within this genre where it's, okay, the woman has to change this about herself. She has to wear this and then the guy will like her. And you really just lean into this idea of somebody else has to accept her for who she is. And that's what a real relationship is. Was that something that when you started on that very first draft was something that was important to you as the core of who this character is throughout?
Yeah, and I think that's the thing, if we're to kind of nail down what was most important to me and what stayed true, it's exactly that. It's the idea, I think, that, as you said, we've seen so many rom-coms, and some of them I love, but where the female character thinks that she's got to fit herself into a tiny box only to come to realize that, like, you know, oh, I don't actually have to fit myself into a tiny box, and or a skinny box or a socially acceptable box or whatever the box is. And I think for me, always, one of the things I'm proudest of about this film is that Lucy is a character who asks the world to love her, not despite the fact that she is weird, but because she is weird. And that's something that, like, you know, perhaps subliminally when I was 26 years old, I was searching for in my own right. And I think we all deserve in our lives. And so that was really important for me to keep, and something that, like, I never wanted to lose track of in the script and then in making the film.
Yeah, well, I'm so glad you did. And the film is so, so wonderful. And thank you so much for taking time today to talk to us about your entire process behind writing and directing this.
Oh my God, I hope it was at all helpful in any way, shape, or form, or informative. But thank you. It's so fun to talk about this stuff. It's really, directing this movie was truly like the greatest honor of my life. So I'm very excited to always chat about the way that it came together.